Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this symposium on the future of research and practice on education for environmental sustainability. I'm Linda, this is Lizzie. We're going to be brief because we have a series of sprints which should give a wonderful flavour of research and practice in education for environmental sustainability. So this is the format for the event. We have 8 speakers, each talking for a super brief 6 minutes each, covering 3 themes. So we've got knowledge, values and capabilities, empathy, spirituality and justice, and participatory and democratic approaches. We're going to take all questions and points for discussion at the end to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to speak. Okay, so our first speaker is Sarah Clayton from University of York.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. My name's Sarah Clayton. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of York, and my PhD is partly funded by BERA through their scholarship, their 2022 fellowship. So thank you to BERA for that. So I'm interested in 3 questions, and I feel like I should caveat this by saying I think that knowledge is really important but not sufficient. But the focus of my PhD is around knowledge. So I'm interested in what kind of threshold concepts we think are fundamental that secondary science students need to learn before they leave compulsory education. But I'm particularly interested in the level of consensus that exists between different expert groups. And the different expert groups I'm focusing on are climate scientists, youth climate activists, and secondary science teachers who have a kind of interest or specialism around sustainability. So for my study, this is a synthesis that I did adapted from Efrat Ilam's scoping table of climate change associated content. So when I went through literature, I adapted her table slightly by adding a systems thinking approach across the top. So it's kind of lens the way you would approach this knowledge. And I added extra columns for the effect, the action and the effective aspects. But this table is available on the BERA blog if you want to have a look at it, or I can email it to you if you're interested. But I used this as a prompt. So I gave participants this as a prompt. I asked them to read this and just reflect on what they thought might be transformative when we think about climate change education. And in terms of transformative knowledge, I'm interested in those concepts which result in a change in perspective that give people a good understanding of that topic. So altogether so far, in my first round of my study, I had 38 participants. So I had 16 climate scientists. I've put the inclusion criteria on here, 12 youth climate activists, and 10 secondary science teachers. So fewer science teachers, but the inclusion criteria were pretty tricky for lots of people to meet. And I debated these in great detail, these inclusion criteria. And so far, I've surveyed these groups, and they were asked to come up with concepts that they thought were transformative, to try and define those concepts, and then to give a reason why they felt they were really, really important. And altogether, I came up with about 69 concepts through this coding. I used thematic analysis, and there were kind of broad themes. And it was interesting that the table I gave them, I don't know if I can go back, but had socioeconomic aspects as a column. That wasn't something that came up when people were surveyed. So I added different columns on here. And there's a second kind of theme I identified around scientific evidence. So these were concepts around discipline, the kind of discipline of climate science and how that's evolved. And it seemed to be quite linked to kind of trust in science. So of those 69 concepts, it's useful to say, I think, the first thing that's striking is only about 10 of them are actually currently referenced in the science GCSE curriculum or in the national curriculum. And some of them, they might come up, but they're not explicitly referenced in the way that participants saw them or can kind of conceive them. And I thought I'd share a few of these concepts that I've got with you. They need refining, and that's the next stage of my process. I'm returning them to participants for additional comments, but I thought some of them were quite interesting to share. So this was a concept that came up multiple times. I've put a colour just to indicate which theme I primarily thought it fell under. But this one came up a lot. It was this idea that climate does not equal carbon, and that actually when we think about climate change, we often reduce it to focus on carbon, and a lot of people felt like that was not useful, and it was oversimplifying the problem, and it exacerbated people's understanding and the way we deal with it. So I've got there the concept, the definition, and some of the explanations, which are direct quotes from participants. So I can give you a moment to read that. And then the next one. This was another example of a very scientific concept. So again, greenhouse gases come up in the curriculum, but we don't ever really talk about the lifetimes of greenhouse gases and how these differ. And you can see some of the explanation of why participants felt that was particularly transformative and why that was useful for students to understand. Sorry, I want to make sure you have enough time to read it, but I'm interested, I'm aware of time. This was another one. So there were others which kind of covered the more kind of ethical justice aspects, and wherever people mentioned impacts of climate change, it was interested that that always went in hand with the kind of climate justice aspects. So CBDR, or Common but Differentiated Responsibility, came up a lot. Across the board, participants mentioned this, and this idea that, you know, we have to take into account historic emissions. That's not something that, you know, I taught science for a long time. It's not something that's ever come up when I've had CPD on this or really looked at how I would teach this. So I thought that was quite interesting. And then another one, which I'll share quickly because before I run out of time, is this one on climate doomism. So one of the concepts that people brought up a lot was tipping points, and they felt like that was important, and this kind of non-linearity when we're looking at climate change. But also this climate doomism aspect was there. So this idea that it's a continuum, and actually every action we take can avert the worst case scenario. And that's something I think a lot of students and teachers don't really understand. It can feel like it's futile, you know, it's too late now to do stuff. And that's not actually the case. We still have that possibility. So that gives you a flavour of the many concepts that came out of this research. So again, I'm going into my second round and then investigating what different perspectives exist around these concepts and the level of consensus. I have run out of time, so I have my email address there, or if you have any thoughts or questions or advice for me, yeah, greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Anderson. I'm doing a PhD at Anglia Ruskin University, and I've just started my third year, my final year. So today I'm going to very quickly whiz through those. So my project is funded by my university, and it's linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. You all know the context, you know, the climate emergency, so I'm not going to go into that. People who are here know something about environmental education. We've been talking about it since 1977. I believe it's Paul Varr who said that we've been talking about this for so long, it must be important, or we haven't changed anything about it. We haven't done anything about it. And that's because what we have been doing, according to the Heinz model, is that we've been educating knowledge education rather than action. And that's not what Hunger and Volk had suggested. So we need something different. Greg Mannion said that, you know, to change educational practice and to address the wicked problems of sustainability, we need new assemblages to interrupt the contemporary status quo. So I'm focusing on Christian environmental education, and why would I do such a thing? The thing is, I'm doing an ethnography, a qualitative study, and with my job was to look at environmental and sustainability education providers, so I needed to focus. I come from Malta, from a Catholic country, so that is why perhaps another thing. I was looking at the literature review, and I noticed that there isn't much research about this, actually. Because I come from Malta, perhaps, I thought, like, so what is the church doing about this? So, you know, when it comes to, I'm mentioning the church because for me it means values, it means, you know, it's something deep within us. So, serious. So, should they not be saying something about this? So, partly it was my inspiration, and it was also the timing. I started this PhD in 2021 when there was COP26. A lot was going on the faiths. The faiths together were doing a lot at this time. So I was thinking, so why isn't there anything about environmental education? Something else that happened around the Sustainable Development Goals is Laudato Si, is the Pope's letter. And it's quite interesting. This generated a lot of action on environment education, Christian environmental education. In fact, in Laudato Si, there's a whole chapter about ecological education.
So, you know, there's a push to do a lot about this, yet I wasn't seeing anything linking it with research in environmental education. So I could go on about Laudato Si. There's lots on about it, but one of the most important things, it introduces the concept of integral ecology and ecological conversion. And some people say, some authors say, that actually Laudato Si is written in a post-humanist way. So then I thought, like, right, you know, this is great. So this is some of the action going on in the UK. There's a lot going on internationally about this. So in the UK, there's an institute, Laudato Si Research Centre, which is a college in Oxford, just set up around Laudato Si. There's a lot going on with A. Rocha and the churches. So these are just some of what I found was going on. So the problem is that, you know, that is the missing thing. There is nothing specifically about this. So my question is, like, can we learn from it? Why hasn't this been looked into so much? So these are my research questions. So I wanted to find out what is this Christian environment education, and can we learn from it? Does it work? Doesn't it work? So I'm looking at two groups. So a qualitative research. So I've been going to one of the groups particularly for one whole year. So it's ethnographic and participate in the learning and what they do, basically. So some of the emerging themes, as you can read out there, you know, constructive hope, you know, what was basically mentioned this morning. So intergenerational learning, most of it is transformational learning. So the people who actually take this course, they end up doing something. So it's an active, you know, it leads to action. And it's also based on constructive hope. So when people come to these groups, they say, you know, we are with like-minded people, we can discuss options, we can discuss solutions. So, you know, there are, as you can see, you know, this is quite common. So the outcomes of this would be to learn more about Christian environmental education in England, that this works, at least for those who participate, those people who are not scared of the word Christian, which actually some of these groups, one of my other groups, it's Laudato Si Center, and it's all for all faiths and none. So people who come there, some of them don't even know it is Christian. So it's the values, that's the key thing. And there are many elements of intergenerational learning, transformational learning, and constructive hope. Something that comes out of this group is gentle activism. So they all kind of encourage people to do something about this. So basically, this is all what I wanted to say, and I hope if you have any feedback, please. Thank you.
Okay, my name's Emma Ransom. I work at Birmingham City University, but I'm doing my PhD at Lancaster University. And the focus of it is education, lecture and student perspectives on sustainability. Or rather, I should say that's the first phase of it. The actual final question will surround student perceptions on sustainability. So my personal background is I grew up on a farm, I've been a forest school teacher. My profession, my lifestyle, my background, it's all about the outdoors. I go outside every weekend. And for me, living that sustainable life has been my focus and my drive for this research. My master's started off with doing concept analysis of moral courage. And from that, I got quite interested in the youth activism side of sustainability, which then fed into curriculums. And then to align it with my current profession of higher education, I wanted to see what policies and systems we had in place. But then in order to get that to really take hold, we need to understand the student voice and their opinions, their perspectives, whether they have that hook on it, and how we get them to get on board with sustainability. So for me, the student voice, listening to their stories, having that social justice lens is all pivotal to my research, hence why it's taking a collaborative approach. So I'll skip to this one. So the first stage is large-scale questionnaires, which turned out not to be so large-scale. And then we're going on to interviews this semester, and hopefully by the end of the year I'll have done some student-led workshops, but we'll see how the time works on that. The aim of the research is to explore lecturer and student perceptions of sustainability. So that's what the questionnaire has focused on. And there's been some really interesting points to it, some contrasting perspectives and opinions from the same people. I want to assess their current level of awareness, their motivations for living sustainably, and also teaching sustainability to their future students, and also the barriers that they come across. And then after that, I would like to identify core principles needed for an effective sustainability curricula within our childhood, youth and community department. It did initially start looking at initial teacher educators, which is what it said on the title for this. Unfortunately, my recruitment for trainee teachers was very poor, so I made it more broad, and we're looking at the childhood, youth and community department where I work instead. So the main research question is, what are student perspectives on sustainability? But then, of course, there's some sub-questions alongside that, such as their current level of awareness, their attitudes and motivations towards sustainability, the barriers, and then what principles they identify they need for a sustainable curriculum, and what key capabilities they would like to achieve at the end. So the results from the questionnaire, I had 15 students, 6 lecturers, and 5 themes that have emerged. So we have knowledge, attitudes and motivation, education for the students, and then lecturer teaching, confidence and barriers. The next 2 slides are just some student and lecturer definitions of what they understand sustainability to mean. And on the whole, they are relative, they're drawing on the same keywords. And then we go on to student knowledge. So what's quite interesting is, although students are aware of what sustainability is, they haven't heard of, on the whole, 2/3 of them haven't heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. You cannot read that in the life of you. But these are each related to the Sustainability Development Goals. So you've got poverty, food security, and how much they're worried about it. These pictures do not align to the PowerPoint that I sent. So underneath here, there should be a lecturer perspective of, do they know what the sustainability goals are? They all knew. And then there was another one for students and what they're concerned about. And what's interesting is they are all concerned about different aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's weird that didn't come up. And then their attitudes and motivation. So what really comes through with this and the students is they have got a clear desire to integrate sustainability into curriculums from 0 to 25 years. They strongly believe that it's important in their education, and they try, on the whole, the ones that have replied, to live a sustainable lifestyle. And the same can be said for lecturers as well. What is interesting, I'll skip a few of these because I'm running out of time. What was the most interesting thing for me out of this was lecturers, and whilst they believe that students should learn about sustainability, that it should be embedded into the curriculums from 0 to 25, they actually don't always see it as their responsibility. There is a definite mismatch of priorities there. They themselves think that they need more education on the matter as well, but then they're also not sure quite how it always fits into the curricula that they're teaching. So I think for me that was the most interesting thing. And again, students aren't confident to teach sustainability, neither are lecturers. So there's wider things at play here. The systems, the training for the lecturers has to change before we can embed it into the curricula. And I'm going to end it there.
My name is Maya Brakovic Thomas, and I'm a PhD student at University of York. My study is looking at what it means to design and deliver educational experiences that develop critical environmental literacy in the context of formal education in the United Kingdom. And I'm interested in looking at this through the lens of climate justice. Now, what we seem to know, based on current conversations and academic literature, is that environmental education should provide a space where pupils can express, exchange, and challenge their environmental knowledge, views, positions, but in reality, that does not happen. Environmental education does not provide that space. If anything, it doesn't really have space of its own. It's kind of homeless, and those few very cold and lonely corners in curriculum it does occupy are primarily concerned with knowledge acquisition and examination. Now, knowledge is great, but as Sarah said, knowledge is important, but it's not sufficient. So, knowing scientific facts is a first step, but it's also important to be aware of wider context in which environmental problems take place, socioeconomic, political, cultural context, and it is also necessary to have skills that define how that knowledge is, or influence how that knowledge is used, valued, and applied. So knowledge and skills together our cognitive domain of critical environmental literacy. And as important as it is, it doesn't necessarily always serve as a motivator for environmentally responsible behavior or empower somebody to respond to these problems in a constructive and efficient way, or even recognize that there are problems. And that's why there is an increasing understanding that it's important to also include affective and behavioral domains into understanding of critical environmental literacy, which are environmental behavior and dispositions. In my study, I'm looking at all 4 building blocks of critical environmental literacy because it's impossible to look at it without considering contribution and interaction of all 4 of them. But because I'm interested in looking at this through the lens of climate justice, I'm particularly focused on dispositions. And I'm looking at them through environmental decision-making. What happens when we are in a situation when we have opposing interests, opposing worldviews or perspectives, which is all the time? How do we decide what's just, what's fair, whose voice matters, and who's excluded or included in that process? And that's where I'm interested to see how dispositions, particularly cognitive empathy, often referred to as perspective taking or ability to see something from somebody else's point of view, and justice sensitivity play in that process, how they shape that process. In order to do that, I've designed an educational initiative that will be delivered in Key Stage 3 by teachers in science, geography, and citizenship. And the main feature of this intervention is something called Citizens' Council. It's a role-based approach where pupils are put in position of policymakers and interested parties when they are debating and making decisions about a range of hypothetical situations, but built around their problems, environmental problems in their local communities. One distinctive feature of this approach that it uses veil of ignorance, something that is extensively researched, debated, and talked about in philosophy and political philosophy in particular, but at least to my surprise, not very much in education. Its essence is that it's a thought experiment where negotiators in a situation when they're trying to reach a solution or solve a problem are deprived of knowledge of whose interest they represent in those negotiations, and are therefore forced not to rely just on self-interest, but consider others' perspectives, and not just somebody else's perspective, but multiple perspectives at the same time. And through that process, I'm interested to see what is the role of cognitive empathy, cognitive empathy and justice sensitivity, and see how they shape that process. There are 4 research questions in my study, and first 2 research questions are concerned with understanding and describing the process of decision-making, interaction, communication, reflection in the classroom. It describes what happens during the intervention in the classroom, and I'm collecting data through lesson observations, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and document analysis. The second part, embedded in research questions 3 and 4, will be process evaluation, because our understanding of how to design and implement these interventions is very limited. It would be great to find out a little bit more about suitability of learning materials, teacher training, suitability of existing critical environmental literacy measuring scales and how they can be made how they can be more appropriate for United Kingdom context for UK education system. And also things also as differences and similarities between different subjects, and even unintended consequences. And it is my hope that through this process, and including process evaluation, that we would be able to, that I would be able to contribute a little bit to our knowledge and understanding how to design these educational interventions that develop critical environmental literacy in a way that promotes more participatory approach to environmental education, but within the constraints of the system and the curriculum. And thank you very much. Please do get in touch if you have any comments or questions.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you all here today. So I'm Lauren Hennessy, based at the University of Bristol. I'll just put up my title so I remember what I'm here to talk about. So I've got this focus on activism, and I'm interested in how we can think about the implications for that for educational policy. I'm just going to start with a disclaimer. This is a sort of opening up of questions. I don't have any answers, and I'm kind of at a point in my own research where I'm at the start of my PhD journey. Just to say a little bit about my background, I've come from training to be a teacher myself and working as a maths teacher. And in 2019, I was teaching maths in schools in Bristol, and I was also quite a concerned environmentalist, taking part in environmental activism, and there was just a bit of a mismatch. I was like, what am I doing? At the same time, I was doing a master's in education, and I decided to make the focus of my master's at that time around youth climate activism. Now, I've just done another master's because I had to for the first year of my PhD, so I decided it would be a useful opportunity to revisit some of that research. So what I did was I built on my 2020 study, and I returned to some of my original participants. So I had 5 activists back in 2020. I managed to re-interview 3 of them this year. And then I also interviewed somebody from Teach the Future, so I got a bit of supplementary data. And these are some questions. They're not research questions. They're just questions. And just in case I don't get to my last slide, it's going to be this again, because as I say, I don't have the answer, so my conclusions are just questions. So, kind of for myself, really, like, does it matter that we listen to these young activists? Like, I think it does, but there's this big question, like, does it? And if it does, why does it? And what would it actually look like if educational systems responded to the calls of the youth climate strikers? And what about incorporating the views of other young people? Because it's only a select few that engage in activism, and there's many barriers to that. And how could young people be meaningfully involved in changing educational policy? And I know there's people in this room doing fantastic work. And I think Linda and Lizzie have a great session tomorrow at 3:30 that might continue some of this discussion. So why is this my interest? I suppose I'm inspired by critical pedagogy, and I remember when I read this quote from Giroux from a 2010 paper, I just thought, this is what the young people are doing. So Giroux says that for Freire, critical pedagogy is a political and moral practice that provides the knowledge, skills and social relations that enable students to explore the possibilities of what it means to be critical citizens while expanding and deepening their participation in the promise of a substantive democracy. And I read this and I just thought, they're already doing that. So how are they doing that? Because the school system that I see, that I work in, it's not teaching them to do that. So they're teaching themselves, they're informing themselves. And I felt like that was something that we as educators and education researchers could learn from the young people. And research does say that community learning through youth-led movements is often inspired or informed by critical pedagogies. So it's kind of thinking, how can we tap into what they're already doing? So here are my participants. These are just random images. They don't represent them at all. So I've got the 4 of them. So Amari, Bobby and Deo were all involved in organising youth strikes in Bristol back when they were at their peak, sort of before the COVID pandemic. Ziggy on the end there is a Teach the Future organiser and campaigner, or at least they were earlier this year when I spoke to them. So I've returned to these participants, and I'm just going to go through just a few of their quotes from the data because I know I don't have long. In fact, I'm already going to make the executive decision to skip a couple. And I'm going to come straight to this, where I asked them, what would you change about the education system? So what Deo talked about was a move away from the standing at the front talking. I'm really aware that's what I'm doing. But I think I found that really interesting. The first thing they talked about was how we structure our classrooms, what that looks like. And then they went on to say that it would be really good to engage with people outside of schools who were doing things relevant to the subject you were learning. So really about that kind of like community learning, engaging with people in the community. And then Amari, similarly, what they began with was something around those kind of like structural things of how we make decisions. So it was about young people having more choice in what they learned about, making it a more decentralized way of learning, and also bringing in more discussion-based learning. And then the other two participants, Bobby talked about less exam focus, and I'm just going to skip straight on. Ziggy talked straight away about getting climate education in all subjects, so making it more interdisciplinary. So I suppose I said, I'm not going to offer conclusions, but just a brief summary of what I think is really interesting is that what these young people are offering is a complete overhaul, really, of the way we do education. It's not just about the content. It's not what we teach. It's how we do it, how we structure our systems. And I think we've got a lot to learn there. So what my PhD is going to go on to do is look at how can we, as educators, so I'm talking as a teacher, meaningfully work with young people to sort of co-create responses to the crisis that we find ourselves within. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jo. Jo Nicol. I've been working at UCL, but I'm also a PhD student at UCL. I'm in my final stages of the thesis, getting it together. I often hear it's a bit like childbirth, so I'm slightly nervous. But yeah, so I'm just here to just give you a brief overview of the work that I've been doing. Previously, before working at UCL, I was a science teacher, and so this journey sort of begins from me being extremely passionate about the way that children think and understand animals. And I talk about them in terms of non-human animals because obviously all of us sitting in this room are one as well. The bit that I want to focus on today, out of all of the talk that I've looked at and explored at with young children, or with young adults, is kind of offering at the end of this PhD journey a sort of thought or steps towards fostering an empathy within science education that can help towards caring for the environment a little bit more than we may do so at the moment. So if we're thinking about environmental education, two things that I always think about are A, what obviously are the ethical basis for our environmental concerns. So you get children thinking about, well, you know, what should and shouldn't they do in their everyday lives? Why should or should they not value what they are valuing? And that obviously determines the actions that they take. And the other thing to think about as well is, you know, what is the environmental basis? And what I mean by, or Bonnet means by the environmental basis is what are those relationships based on? How are those relationships formed, which then conjure up these ethical concerns that people genuinely feel strongly about. And so, when we're thinking about relationships, it's much more complex than just saying, okay, we've got a relationship with nature or the environment or animals. We've got complex relationships within those. We treat animals differently. We care for them. We kill them. We love them. We hate them. We're fearful of them. And the one that I'm looking at particularly is biology A-level students' relationship with zoo animals, okay? So some of you might think quite passionately about that if we think about how we objectify animals in those spaces, but also maybe how those conjure up certain contemplations that other animal relationships don't. So the way I carried out my study was, like I said, biology A-level classes, so 2 biology A-level classes, and I followed them around the zoo. I recorded their conversations, watched carefully their observations and interactions with each other and with the zoo animal. And then after that, we went back to the classroom and I taught them a post-zoo lesson, and I also interviewed that class. And I began to understand a little bit more about how they were talking about those animals with each other, but also what that meant about the relationship that they had with these animals. Don't know why that came up, sorry. So you don't need to look at all this in detail, but this is just something that came from the analysis when I looked at it. And actually, if you look at the quotes, they look maybe quite standard quotes for what we're thinking about visitors when they visit a zoo. We're thinking about social connections to animals. And the one that I'm specifically focusing on just for today is looking at the interpretive talk that happened during that zoo trip. And in particular, in that interpretive talk, I've got something that's labelled explicit egomorphic talk. So egomorphic, if you've not heard of it, it's not very well known, but ego is obviously the sense of self and morphic is a form of. So lots of the talk that the children engaged with at the zoo was anthropomorphic talk, so placing human-like traits onto animals in order to understand them, make meaning from them. But this particular talk really is quite interesting for today's talk, so I thought, okay, what it seemed to be doing is, the interpretive talk formulated this empathetic consideration, which wasn't always seen, and actually wasn't seen at all when they started talking about local animals. So just for example, the first one there, they're talking about a lion at the enclosures. They realise that the lions are from different families, and they're feeling quite uncomfortable with the fact that they're from different families, and they're coming together, and they then use that sense of putting themselves into the perspective of that animal to then realise and conjure up an empathetic emotion towards them. And we've already spoke about cognitive empathy, and I think you can probably say from all of these things that they're not necessarily realistic or accurate representations of the empathy that maybe they should be engaging with. But it is certainly a form of affective empathy, and that's something worthwhile to look at, I argue. So I've got a really simplified version. This could be for something in primary school teachers, or it could go all the way up to Key Stage 5 or beyond. But if we're thinking about animals and we're thinking about the implications that this type of talk can have in classrooms, I argue that it's important to foster an imaginative empathy. I'm going to go to the middle one initially here, where we're looking at someone looking at what the animal is thinking or feeling from the perspective of that animal. And that's really hard to do because obviously we live in our own world and we see the world in the way that we see it. But that can then begin from this naivety. This can then begin to sort of foster a relationship where we're thinking, well, it shows that there's some intrinsic value associated with that. But beyond that, what also started to happen was when the children started talking, there was a sense of intrinsic value and recognition of alterity. So recognizing that these animals were different to those humans as well, which is something that is quite useful and important when we're thinking about critiquing the notion of anthropomorphism. So I'll just leave you with the final statement that Jack was making about when he was speaking about his zoo trip, and I think there's 4 things in here that are really important. He was sort of saying, okay, it was really strange. Seeing the zoo animals made me feel connected to them. Okay, so that the importance of connection is there, but they are not people, so this recognition of being different is really important in the science classroom. They have their own lives, they're recognising that the perception of their world is very different to ours, and I feel sad for them, so this role of emotion. And then finally, they may not be here in a few centuries or decades, so fostering that idea that we need to think about not just the individuals, but the actual species as well. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Kerry, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I'm a second-year PhD researcher at University of York, but prior to that, I was a secondary school librarian. And I very much cared about reader development, literacy, and doing this in very diverse forms, and also underpinning it was a lot about student well-being. And something that students began to talk to me more and more about is eco-anxiety and their judgment of lack of fairness within the system, where they felt that coverage in the curriculum was very patchy for them, depending on what they learnt, and equally they didn't have agency. They felt because they couldn't vote, they weren't being listened to by politicians, and they felt that they were penalised if they went to a Fridays for Future strike, then they were given an unauthorised absence. So they weren't supported by the school there either. So they felt caught in the middle, but bearing the brunt of the climate emergency. I went off later to do an Environment MA at Lancaster University, where I was very fortunate to be taught by Professor Becky Willis. I used an awful lot on deliberative democracy, and that really chimed for me about how you can involve society in the climate emergency and give them the voice. And that is where I first came across the powerful metaphor of spaceship Earth. So this is an AI version of spaceship Earth, and here we have these people going, can I have a go at controlling this? Can I make a difference, please? And so Becky wrote about it. Being a librarian, I have to show you the book. But she wrote about it in this brilliant book, Too Hot to Handle, about democracy and climate change. The metaphor, Spaceship Earth, is taken from Buckminster Fuller, who looked at in 1969 and said, we're overriding these special features of our planet. We're not taking care of its sustainability. And he talked too about knowledge and acquisition and the hoarding of it and how you can use that and how it can be used against other countries and in a sort of anti-democratic way. It could be used for commercial reasons and so on. And the need for information to be more democratic and for people to be involved in helping to fly Spaceship Earth. This last week, a UK public engagement strategy came out, and that again talks about holistic thinking and how we need to support everybody to be involved. And again, it comes back to the question of fairness. People need to know what is happening to them. To get on board, to get to net zero, people need to be involved in decision making. And it reminded them, the government, of the need to think across local, regional, national, international levels and show there the engagement of people, true participation. And so that capability for voice, I think, is a wonderful way of capturing that. And I love that quote. And I also love the fact that Dewey, way back in 1899, really got it, that democracy has to be looked after and cherished and worked at generation after generation. And education is really, really significant for that. In fact, there was something in the news today about young people and democracy and feeling less, internationally, feeling less confident about it than ever. So underpinning this, I think with climate change being so complex and looking across these different temporal scales and so on, and spatial scales, I think place-based learning is really, really valuable to sort of hone it and make it relevant to the learner. And I think coupled with powerful knowledge as well, where young people have an autonomy of the knowledge and they're able to analyse it and own it and share it, I think is really, really valuable. So I'm coupling these two things together for my deliberation. And I'm aware time's going to go any minute. And I'm looking at, I live in Cumbria, and you may have come across the proposal for the first coal mine in 30 years, and the Cumbria coal mine in Whitehaven. And AI, again, I've used to sort of have a look at, I said, give us a colliery in Whitehaven. And it shows there, you've got the fells, you've got the sea, and you've got the mining industry. And down below there, you've got a painting that is back in the 1730s, and that depicts what Whitehaven looked like then. And there's an incredible poem written in 1770 by John Dalton, where he talks about commerce and how fantastic that is for Whitehaven. And unlike the Romantic poets, the Cumbrian poets like Wordsworth that come later and are anti the Industrial Revolution, John Dalton's saying, this is great, this is bringing industry and life to our town. Yeah, polluted waters, yeah, sulphurous coal, but you can go elsewhere to see Loddle Falls and Borrowdale and all the other beautiful parts of the Lake District. It doesn't matter here. Whitehaven has become something of perhaps a sacrifice zone. And the trickiness is, if you look at its geographical location there, it's fairly isolated. It's not in the honeypot part of Cumbria. It does have some tourism, but big employers like Sellafield have been decommissioned. The last coal mine was actually active until 1986. And so there's this kind of fond heritage still of mining and what it can mean. So while internationally there's been an outcry after COP26 of leadership and why the UK government is going ahead with it, in parts of Cumbria, people are very, very anti it. In Whitehaven, although they recognise that there could be social pariahs for thinking that they want it, oh, I've got 1 minute. Goodness, I'm trying to think what's really important that I need to tell you. Okay, so I just wanted to say as well, just really quickly about the demographic. You have got an ageing population in Cumbria. You have got 5% less, at 20%, of 0 to 19-year-olds living in that area. Half of all job benefit claimants in Cumbria live in Copeland, the area where the mine is, and a quarter of adults there are without qualifications. So importantly, when we're looking, and I will now, at the deliberation, we need to think, when we're giving the young people agency and the chance to sort of steer, as it were, to pilot a spaceship Earth, we need to be asking them, what are the opportunities grounded in place? What are the different discourses that you can recognise here? How can you apply critical thinking and analytical thinking and own this knowledge? And there's something very, I think, wonderful. There are many, many forms of deliberative democracy, climate juries, drama, sort of role-playing and all the rest of it. But the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review, for me, is absolutely great because it balances what's sort of called agonism and deliberation. You can appreciate diverse voices within it. The students can write up together, having deliberated, and say, this is our overall opinion. However, there is the caveat that this person felt this or this person felt that. And together they can produce a report that we will disseminate and make sure that their voices are heard. So finally, please, sorry it was so rushed, but please do get in touch with me or have a chat sometime during the conference because it would be lovely to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you. I'm very conscious that I'm quite small behind this. I should have gone with bigger shoes. My name's Claire Ranjan. I'm from the University of Stirling and I have recently completed my PhD, which I'm totally for. So amazing. But what I was looking at was citizen science. So in particular, I was a secondary science teacher as well, taking my pupils out, looking at citizen science as an excuse to get them outdoors. And so I thought, what does this do then for the pupils? What does this actually mean? So I looked to understand the development of eco-citizenship capabilities through citizen science as an experience. So we know from all the things we've been talking about today and across the different things that we've been reading that young people are increasingly taking action. They're increasingly taking public action in response to these environmental concerns, but they spend so much time in school that as a school community, as a school kind of environment, we need to help to support them to navigate the environmental challenges that we have, but also to understand how we can better support them as a research community to confidently respond to these contemporary challenges. So I wanted to understand what citizen science as a thing does. So citizen science is where most often scientific organisations bring a project together and non-scientists contribute to that particular project. So bringing that into schools, you're already asking young people to contribute to something that is bigger than themselves, that's more than just their own school. What does that look like for those pupils? How do they understand that experience and how do they then respond and reflect on that? I wanted to look at it from a citizenship perspective, but as we've already heard, that citizenship perspective is complex. They can't vote, they can't buy electric cars, they don't have domestic budgets under their control. So I used a lived citizenship lens to really try and understand what the opportunities that were afforded by that citizen science experience and the curriculum, how the curriculum refracted through that. So I took a massively multi-method case study approach to 3 particular citizen science projects. Mickey is Moorland Indicators of Climate Change. Opal is widely known and is predominantly biodiversity related, and Soil Fertility Legacies was a tiny single-use year project from the University of Stirling up in Westeros in the Northwest Highlands. So I was drawing on situational analysis with place-responsive new materialist approaches, and you have this kind of messy kind of iteration of maps to understand what's happening for the pupils, for the teachers, and for the scientists involved. So the key aspects that came out of that process of understanding, of discussing of kind of relational understandings, is that the citizen science practice in itself is both sensory and relational. They were messy, they were muddy, they were cold, they were hungry, and they talked about all of those things. They also then talked to the scientists involved and their teachers about things that they might not have done otherwise. So it opened up space for those conversations, those intergenerational, interdisciplinary conversations that went out with their specific subject. And so what that did then was let them look at a place differently, look at the things they found there differently, and opened up that those opportunities. So caring for that place, having those intergenerational discussions, but predominantly those more than human encounters. They were able to come into contact with species that were not themselves in a way that they were looking at them differently and asking questions about them. So this is a really nice survey response. So it's made me more comfortable around bugs and insects because I'm seeing they're just as important as others. I am now more aware that diversity is important for the ecosystem, and if there is any human impact, it can be damaging more than we think. So it's that raising awareness, that putting them in that position to look and look again and think about what they were doing. The experience made them more self-conscious, more aware of our surroundings, so now you know how to help. And that came through really strongly, that this is a way to do something. And again, that constructive hope that's already been mentioned, it's an active, participatory thing they can do that made them feel better, made them know that what they were doing might only make a tiny difference, but it might make a difference. And so overall, citizen science practices in schools does give that space. It's not perfect, there are challenges, there are barriers, but it does give young people space to make those personal responses to environmental concerns and think about what that means. But we need to support schools as that vital context. Our young people spend so much time there to encounter and engage with citizen science practices, as those citizen science practices can then lead to the development of important eco-citizenship capabilities. And I thought this quote was a nice one to kind of finish on, because it's a nice debatable one. I think if it was in the curriculum, it would solve all the problems. Because it always does, doesn't it? If it was actually in there as something they should do as part of their curriculum, take part in a citizen science project, it would be something that would help. So that's coming from that scientist perspective. Give us a bit of your schools, give us a bit of your young people. Let's get them to do it. Let's make them do it. Is that the way we would want to do that? Is that the answer? Possibly not. For discussion.